right? Anybody else? I think it's the other way. I think it's, I hear you, but I ain't listening to you. And we'll look at the differences in those two things and kind of what that might mean. Here is a few things that people have said about that very thing. Hearing is listening to what is said, but listening is hearing to what isn't said. Another way of saying it, it's one thing to hear what someone is telling you, it's another to listen to what that someone said. What's that mean? Anybody know? Is it just me that looks at that and goes, kind of gives it the lassie look? Because I'm like, what's the difference? Is it what Stephen said? You hear noise. Is listening the paying attention? Where hearing is just your ears are working? Do we agree with that? Some people are just listening until they can talk. Okay, yeah. Yeah, it just depends on who you're talking to, right? Or who you're listening to. It could be. Stephen Covey said this: most people do not listen with the intent to understand. Most people listen with the intent to reply. To your point, right? Just waiting for my time to speak. But during that time, are we really paying attention to what's being said? And are we really listening to what's actually being said? So let's look at this idea of what James says here about let every person be quick to hear. So who here, just your show of hands, who here would say, who feels like you yourself is a good listener? 1, 2 brave souls, right? 3 brave souls, raise their hand. It means that I'm not talking to any of the rest of y'all because y'all ain't going to hear anything I'm telling you. You hear us, yeah. I hear what you're saying, but I don't know that I'm really listening to what you have to say. All right, for you 3, I'm going to put you on the spot. What does it take to be a good listener? I would put my hand up too. I think I'm a pretty good listener. But what does it take to be a good listener? Yeah.
Telling you things that are stressful to them, and you don't want to zone out on that. You want to hear what they're saying, and you want to, maybe there's something you can do to help them.
Okay. What were you saying?
I said it in kind of the same way you just said. It takes action on your part.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. And you got to want it, right? You got to want to listen to somebody. John?
Tasha says this, I always said it before, I'm waiting to reply.
Yeah.
And talk about this with some of the guys I work with, especially men. We solve problems. So if you're talking to me and complaining about
Wheels are turning.
I'm already thinking, well, you need to do this.
Yeah.
You have to do this.
Yeah.
Same thing with my kids. You got to do this.
Yeah.
Why don't you do this?
Yeah. I agree.
That'll fix it.
Yeah. Just do what I say. Right? What were you going to say?
I think to a certain degree it requires a certain amount of humility.
Yeah.
Because you have to put what you want and what you're thinking about aside to really understand what the other person is saying.
Yeah. And that's what I say. You gotta want to be a listener. You gotta want to be listening at that time. Now, let's throw this out there. Sometimes people are going to come talk to you and you're thinking, this is the last thing I really want to hear right now, right? And your mind is somewhere else and things are just, your own personal world is in disarray. Somebody else comes to you and you gotta, sometimes it's a struggle, right? Sometimes you gotta think about, I gotta really concentrate and listen and pay attention to what somebody says because my mind is really over here, but I need to be right here, to this person in front of me. Sure, I think that's right. I think there's action. I think there's certainly an aspect of desiring to be that, and I'm going to desire to put the person talking to me first, right at this time. So humbleness, I believe you're correct with that. So what about this? What are the benefits? Think about that situation. You got a good listener, hearer, whatever we want to define that as, and somebody's talking to you as a good listener. What are the benefits of being that listener or that hearer? Mike and Julie, y'all both said y'all are good listeners. Julie comes home from work one day and says, Mike, I really got to talk to you about something. Mike, you got to sit and listen. What benefit are you getting out of that, Mike?
I didn't know she raised her hand.
She did. Halfway. She kind of did this. So the benefits, what are the benefits of the listener or the hearer?
Be there for someone.
You're building a relationship, you're strengthening a relationship because you're there for them. The humility part, right? I'm going to set aside everything associated with me. I'm not going to be selfish here. I'm going to focus on this person who's talking to me. Yeah.
It's being the best friend.
It's being a friend, right? Strengthens the relationships. There may be a sense of understanding, right? There's maybe somebody's talking to us because they say you've been through this or you've experienced something, and I've come to you because you can understand. And so you can then provide that understanding to somebody, and there's a benefit in that because you're building on those relationships. There might be a learning aspect to it. Hey, you're telling me something I wasn't aware of. Tell me more, and let's really listen and concentrate. So let's flip that. What are the benefits to the speaker? To know that there's somebody there listening to them, what's the benefit to them? What? I just need to vent, right? Yeah, I just need to get this out. Yeah, to feel like somebody cares, right, Josh? There's a cost savings in it because you don't have to pay a therapist. Okay, I get it. Yeah, and again, that strengthens those relationships, right? There's a building of trust there that's certainly important. Now we're talking about this in our everyday life, but I want you to be thinking about this as, what does that mean to us as Christians? What does that mean to us from a spiritual growth standpoint? How does being a good listener, somebody who's quick to hear, the idea of being quick to hear, what does he really mean by, what is he getting at when he's talking about this term of being quick to hear? What's James trying to tell us by using that term? What's he saying to us? What? Pay attention. Okay, yeah, what else? Put them first. Yeah, what else? What? Being eager. Yeah, and willing, right?
I think it also means open-minded.
Okay.
So that you haven't already closed up your mind to the other side of the coin.
Yeah, I think that's accurate too. I think it's the idea of, I'm just calling Michael out. I don't mean this about Michael. He's just sitting right here, but oh man, here comes Michael again. I wonder what he's got to tell me this time. To your point, right? And we go ahead and shut off the idea of how can I get out of this discussion fast because I got something to do, right? Instead of just what you're saying, open the mind up and say, you know what? Let's have a conversation because the other side of that is the benefit to that speaker. Somebody who comes to a person who's a listener, they need somebody right then, right? And you're providing, I'll say a service. That's really not the right word, but you're providing something to them that they are direly in need of at that point. Somebody just to listen. And so, I think all those points are valid. This idea of being quick to hear, it's like don't shut people out, right? Don't shut them off that quick. Mike?
I think probably with technology and the way things have come along over the years, it may be more difficult for people to be listeners.
Yeah.
I can remember seeing my grandmother, someone would call her house, she would pull a chair out, and she'd get the phone. I mean, she was going to give them her full attention.
Yeah.
Whatever was about to be said on that other end of the phone.
Right.
It's probably more difficult nowadays because of all the technology and all the things we have coming at us.
Right.
Second of the day.
Yeah. Well, now the conversations are like lightning fast, right? Text, right? I'm going to get what I got to say out really quickly in 2 or 3 texts. LOL, K, usually it used to be hey, that sounds really good. Now it's K. So yeah, we've destroyed the English language. What's interesting about this too is coming from James, right? This message about this notion behind, being quick to hear. James was brother of Jesus, and took a while for him to kind of catch on to what Jesus was saying and accept him for who he was. So to hear him say, hey, let's be quick to hear. He wasn't so quick himself. Maybe he learned a lesson along the way, right? And that he was able to then say this. Let's look at a couple of passages of Scripture that talks about being a listener or listening. Go back to Solomon and some of his fine words. Proverbs 12:15 says, the way of a fool is right in his own eyes, but a wise man listens to advice. What's our nature when it comes to whether it be criticism or advice that somebody's going to come bring to us, somebody's throwing that our way, what's some of that nature? Goes back to what Julie said. Throw up that fence sometimes, we throw up that wall. I'm not ready to hear this, right? I say it all the time. So a lot of times we're very quick to, shrug off some of those kinds of things. But normally when someone is providing that kind of information to us, there's probably some nugget of truth in there somewhere that we can take and use to help make ourselves better. Solomon here is telling us to pay attention to that advice, right? That there's things there that a wise man's going to listen to when it comes to that advice that we can use to become better people and not be so quick to shrug it off. To prove that, he goes on to say in verse 31 and 32 of chapter 15, the ear that listens to life-giving reproof will dwell among the wise. Whoever ignores instruction despises himself, but he who listens to reproof gains intelligence. What does reproof mean? Correction. Reread that. The ear that listens to life-giving correction will dwell among the wise. Whoever ignores instruction despises himself, but he who listens to correction gains intelligence. Now, correction, reproof, can come to us in a couple different ways. Somebody can sit you down and say something to you in such a way where it feels like they just gave you a piece of cake, and it was so nice the way they sat there and said what they said to you. But then others can say something to you in such a way where you want to slug them, right? I was like, how dare you say that to me, right? And so how things get delivered, of course, matters. But here in this case, what Solomon's talking about, we can listen to these kinds of things, and from it helps us to be wiser, helps us to gain intelligence. In Proverbs 19:20 says, listen to advice and accept instruction, that you may gain wisdom in the future. So there appears to be, in what Solomon says, wise man, right? There appears to be a connection between listening and wisdom or intelligence. That's what he keeps talking about. Remember, if you look back in James 1 verse 5, it says, if any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all liberally and without reproach, and it will be given to him. So we ask God through prayer for wisdom. How does God going to speak to us? He's going to talk to us through His Word. So if we study His Word and we listen, going back to this idea of listening, right? When God speaks to us, are we listening? Are we taking what He says to us? Solomon says that if we listen to this advice, and we accept instruction, then wisdom can be gained. Well, if we want wisdom from God, James 1:5 says we ask for that. And how do we get it? Well, if we study and we read, that advice and that instruction then is going to come from God. But we have to listen. We have to listen. The only way we're going to be listening to God in the sense of what He has to say is we've got to read. We've got to see what God has to say about things. And so we go in and we dig into the Word. Let me ask this before we move on to talking about anything else, or if you have any comments. Are there any Bible characters or Bible stories or lessons that teach about the importance of listening, or maybe not listening, that you can think of? Or anybody come to mind? Ananias and Sapphira, tell me that one.
Well, they were supposed to give a certain amount and they didn't.
Okay.
And they lied about what they gave and caused them some problems.
Okay. Who else did I hear? Who? Tell me about Samuel. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Didn't listen at first, right? Yep. Josh, I see your hand. Okay. He didn't listen. Yeah. Yep. Yep. Right. Yeah. And what I thought about with the Israelites, I mean, how many times, holy smokes, how many times did they just, Moses would tell them something, God would tell them something through Moses, and they just went, did whatever they chose to do, right? And they just had to keep bringing them back, bringing them back, bringing them back.
This may be a stretch, but I'm thinking Samson and Delilah.
Okay, tell me about that one.
Well, he was hearing what she was asking,
Okay.
but
clearly wasn't listening to what she was saying, right? Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a good one. Yeah, I think that's a good point. I found this too. I thought this was good, looking at just phrases about the idea of listening. The biggest mistake made by most human beings, listening to only half, understanding just a quarter, but telling double. Right? Which leads us then to the next part of the verse. Let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak. Knowing now, here we are, we're getting into something that can be a little harder for people to do, this idea of being slow to speak. And that's to say that, something when, the idea of saying something when sometimes it might be best just to not say anything, right? It's not just to listen. Be quick to hear, but don't necessarily have to speak to what's being said to us. For example, there's an age-old question that goes something like this: which is better, to remain silent and be thought a fool, or to speak and remove all doubt? Right? Say that another way: better to keep your mouth shut and appear stupid than open it and prove it. Right? Sometimes it's better not to speak. Here's some phrases or some different sayings I found, and then I'm going to point to a few in particular about this idea of being silent or not speaking. Sometimes it's far better to be quiet and let things happen the way it is destined to be. Also, learn to be silent and always remember that everything in life has a purpose. There are 5 situations that this particular person spoke. This person's name is APJ Abdul-Kamar. He was truly a rocket scientist, not kidding. He was a astrophysicist and worked for in that field, but he also was the former president of India. He named 5 times situations where we should keep silent. Number 1, when you don't know what to say or you're doubtful about your thoughts and knowledge on particular aspects, always keep silent. Number 2, don't say anything when someone is criticizing another person. Don't be a part of such negativity. Number 3, when someone shouts in anger and hatred, you can pacify that person by keeping quiet. Number 4, be quiet when you're angry or upset. Take enough time to figure out why you feel the way you do. That's where we get in our troubles sometimes, right? Sometimes we get into some mistakes because we jump right out there and say something when maybe it'd be better just to take a step back and think about it. And number 5, when someone is emotionally sharing some incidents of their life, try to listen quietly and to be silent. Found this too. It's an acrostic. If you take the word think, before you speak, think, is it true? Whatever I'm about to say, is it true? Is it helpful? Is it inspiring? Is it necessary? And lastly, is it kind? A lot of things to think about before we speak, but if we're listening, we got time to really think through, okay, I want to make whatever I say, these are words that I'm going to speak back, I want to make sure that they're, am I telling the truth? Is it helpful? Is it going to inspire this person or whoever might be listening to me? And what I'm going to say, is it kind and is it really necessary as a part of the conversation, right? I think that's a pretty cool little acrostic there. So let's talk a little bit about this. So let's go back to the same question asked a while ago. Think about slow to speak. What's the message behind the notion of being slow, quote unquote, to speak? What's James trying to tell us there? Think before you speak? Yeah. Same thing? Yeah. Think before you speak? Sure. Sometimes that tongue just rolls out and we trip all over it, right? And we can find ourselves in a mess. It's happened to all of us at some point. How much of an impact does time have on what gets said? This idea of slow, right, being slow to speak. When we're having this conversation or we're having a conversation with somebody, this idea of time, this idea of giving ourselves a minute to think, how much of an impact does that really have? Are there times when, boy, jumping right out there and saying what you got to say is a good thing? Maybe. It depends on the situation, yeah. And maybe being slow to speak is not the best scenario. But what we're talking about here, and you think about everything that we've talked about, and the idea of being tested and temptations and things like that James is talking about through this chapter, We're getting now into where he really starts in chapter 9 and going through verse 19 and going through the rest of the book, all about this idea of faith and building our faith and what faith does, how it obeys, how it proves, how it controls the tongue, and all these different things he's about to get into. It starts right here in this verse. So he's talking about being swift to hear. Make sure you listen. And then make sure you got your tongue where it's supposed to be. Make sure you're saying the things that need to be said. And then we'll get to the other piece of it here in just a minute. Sometimes we speak too quickly. We say something not very helpful, right? Just first thing comes to mind, you throw it out there, and then you're like, ooh, man, I wish I hadn't said that. Mark Twain, I heard this actually just the other day, and I wrote it down when I heard it. Mark Twain is quoted as saying to someone one time when he was having a conversation, he said, "If I had more time, I would have written you a shorter letter." Think about what that means. Think about what that says. If we take the time to think through what needs to be said, we can likely be more concise, we can be more accurate, precise with the words that we want to use, and have more meaning behind what we have to say. And sometimes we just blunder on and on and on and on, and sometimes your listeners got to filter out everything that we said to get the meaning out of what we're trying to say, right? I love that point. If I had more time, I would have written you a shorter letter. Solomon says in Proverbs 16:23, "The heart of the wise makes his speech judicious and adds persuasiveness to his lips." Now we're starting to see a connection to what, and it really goes back to, think about it when we talk about being quick to hear also, you're kind of going back to what is in one's heart, right? It says it here, the heart of the wise makes his speech judicious. If our heart is in the right place, what comes out of our mouth. James talks about it later in chapter 3. He talks about controlling the tongue. He talks about that very thing. What's in us is what's going to come out of us, right? Garbage in, garbage out. Good stuff in, good stuff out, right? And where our heart is going to help control what we say. So go back, think about that, to being quick to hear. How does one's heart play into the role of a listener? I think we said it. Being humble. Making sure we put the selfishness aside and we take the time to listen and talk to the person that's standing there in front of us, to listen to that person to make sure that we're being helpful in the process. Proverbs 19:1 says, "Better is a poor person who walks in his integrity than one who is crooked in speech and is a fool." So let's ask the same question we asked a while ago. Bible characters or stories or lessons that teach about the importance of not speaking too quickly or remaining silent. You tell me about Peter. Peter jumped out there in a hurry a lot of times, didn't he? Yeah, he was real quick to step out there and stumble over his words a few times. Yeah, I agree. Who else? Yeah, Peter. Talking about Peter? Yeah. Yeah, until he was corrected, and then he was like, "Oh, whoa. Get my head too while you're at it." Right? Yeah. I should have just waited to see how that shook out. Really? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. You wonder if he was thinking that. Oh man, I shouldn't have said anything. How about Job's friends? When everything happened with Job, he had friends show up. They sat there for how long? 7 days, didn't say one word. Didn't say one word, just sat. They could see the anguish, they could see the pain that he was going through, and so they just sat around on the ground with him and just sat and didn't say a word. Well, that's true, right? I mean, then came the speaking part, and they still messed up, right? But at the time, that was what Job needed. Sometimes we don't have to say anything, right? I'll give you another one. What about Jesus? When he was standing in trial, Pilate saying all the things that he's saying to him, he stood there, didn't say a word, and he impressed Pilate so much that Pilate did everything he could to get him freed. He didn't have to say anything, right? Sometimes saying nothing, being slow to say anything, is a good thing. And it can really help a person or help a situation by just being there and not saying anything. And in Jesus' case, his reputation, everything that he had been doing and what people had been saying about him, Pilate had heard all about it, wanted to meet him, all of those things. So he knew who he was and what he was about. And then when Jesus just stood there, he marveled. He was like, wow, don't you know that I can free you? Go ahead.
I know this is talking about when we talk, speak, communicate with one another, but also in a technology world, when you get an email that's vicious
Yeah.
or confrontational, sometimes it's best to just give it the time to do, which is no time.
Yeah.
Just set that aside.
I've said many times I've gotten an email and it didn't hit me the right way or something, and I reply and I started typing, and then I closed it and saved it. I came back the next day and completely redid it. It's not the right time to do that when we're angry, right? Yeah, and so that goes a long ways towards resolving situations or being to sit down and talk to somebody about a situation, whatever the case may be, instead of firing off those responses really quick because something didn't sit with us the right way. To your point, right? Sometimes with emails. So let's talk about that next piece then, because that's where we're headed, right? Quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. Isn't it interesting the order in which James uses these three things, right? First, we got to be diligent to listen. We got to make sure that we're willing and able and eager to listen to something that's being said to us. And if we take the time to listen and carefully consider what's being said to us, then it will give us that time that we talked about a second ago to carefully think about our response. What are the right words to use to reply to the situation, or don't reply at all, whatever the case calls for. And then after that consideration, let's not be so quick to get angry over the matter, right? And that's basically what James is saying here. I think he's saying that if we do take the time to listen and speak, it's going to allow us more time to use some of our techniques, to take a breath, count to 10, whatever those things are, right? Whatever it takes for us to discipline ourselves, not to jump to conclusions or to fire something off in an email or from our mouth or in a text or whatever the case is that can harm someone else or harm a situation. So let's ask this question. I know the answer and I know you know the answer, but is anger or getting angry a sin? No. How many times in the Old Testament do we read, and the anger of the Lord was kindled against them, right? Happened all the time, right? Even God got angry over things that his people were doing. We saw where Jesus was angry and how the temple was being used, right? But it is what the anger can lead to, right? Ephesians 4, verse 26, be angry and do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger or on your wrath, as some versions say. So it's okay to be angry, but what do we do with that anger? How do we harness that? How do we make sure that we're watching our speech? Did we really hear? Did we take the time to hear what the person was saying to us? To take the time to kind of process that to make sure that we're not interpreting that in such a way that's going to make us angry or make us mad at somebody that might be standing there right there in front of us. Colossians 3:8, take this a little bit further. But now you must put them all away: anger, wrath, malice, slander, and obscene talk from your mouth. So anger is listed here as something that we are to put away, but it included with that wrath. What is wrath? It's defined as extreme anger. It's when we really want to go after somebody. We're so mad that we want to then take that to the next level. Malice, which is when we intentionally go out of our way to harm somebody or try to hurt somebody's feelings, try to do something that is going to get under their skin. That's malice. Slander, make false and damaging statements about somebody. And then, of course, obscene talk. All of this comes from a starting point of being angry. It can lead to any of those things that then can harm us and harm relationships, and especially harm our relationship with God. This is seen too, if you look at this, look at it a little deeper, this idea of anger. It's seen by God as being such an important character trait that he made it a qualification for being an elder. Look at Titus 1, 7 through 8. For an overseer, as God's steward, must be above reproach. He must not be arrogant or quick-tempered, or a drunkard or violent or greedy for gain, but hospitable, a lover of good, self-controlled, upright, holy, and disciplined. So you got three things in there that really can point back to this idea of how anger can affect us, right? Quick-tempered, right? How fast are we to fly off the handle at something that we don't like? Kind of to the point of the emails, right? Oh, you just wait. I got something to say, you know. And we get really quick-tempered over that kind of thing. Instead of maybe let's take a breath. Let's just think about this. The idea of being self-controlled, again, firing off that email or whatever, you know, or a text or something that somebody said to us. And we want to make sure that we want to make sure we're being heard, right? And sometimes the self-control part of that is, let's take a step back. Slow to speak, let's take a step back. And then the idea of being disciplined, of course, goes along with that. In 1 Timothy 3, same thing. Verses 2 and 3 says, therefore an overseer must be above reproach, the husband of one wife, sober-minded, self-controlled, there's that again, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not a drunkard, not violent but gentle, not quarrelsome, another word there, not a lover of money. What's it mean to be quarrelsome? You're looking for an argument. Just want to pick a fight. You know? I know this is going to get under their skin, so I'm just going to do it. It's not who we are to be. All of these characteristics or these points that we talk about being part of an elder, everybody should have these. But he specifically points to these things in terms of being an overseer in the Lord's church. Nobody wants to, worship in a congregation where your overseers have these kinds of characteristics, or or don't have these kinds of characteristics. So then he goes on in James 1, know this, he says, my beloved brothers, let everyone be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. Then verse 20, for the anger of man does not produce the righteousness of God. So he pulls all of this together, right, under this idea of slow to speak, slow to anger, and quick to hear. He pulls it all back together to say, what does this do for you as a Christian when it comes to being faithful? And he points to that, this idea of anger. We don't want to let our anger get the best of us, because because man's anger does not produce godly righteousness. It's not going to do that. It's not going to allow us to be in any way looked at as a righteous person when we have anger that gets the best of us. How can we be that shining light? We talk about that all the time. Tate did a great demonstration with that Sunday about being that light in a world of darkness. How can we be that when we're getting angry, or we don't have any self-control, or we're being quarrelsome with other people? How are we going to save souls? I don't want to be a part of that church if they act like that guy. He's mad all the time, right? How are we going to be able to do that? How are we going to grow spiritually? We're talking about spiritual growth if we're letting something prohibit the righteousness of God, and that's anger. And all of these things, being quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath, if we cannot do that, it's going to produce those kinds of things in us, where anger is going to bubble up really quickly, really fast, and can become controlling for us in some cases. So let's finish with this. We have just a couple minutes left. How do these verses help to guide us through greater spiritual growth? We're talking about spiritual growth. We talked about a lot of it here as we spoke, but let's talk about this for a minute. How do they help to guide us towards greater spiritual growth?
Help you when you're trying to convert somebody and dealing with them and
Okay.
speak with them and listen to where they're at and if they know anything religious at all and what they're thinking and how to approach it. So.
That's a great point. So I'm going to put you two guys on the spot. Y'all went to deliver a basket to somebody a couple weeks ago, and you got into a 15-minute discussion with somebody. Okay, well, that's what I heard. So how valuable was that to listen to what the person had to say? And, did you come back at them with, no, let me tell you what the Bible says? Of course not, right? So the idea of the idea of listening, right? Absolutely. Yeah, so when we're trying to convert somebody, it does matter. Oftentimes, we are quick to get defensive over our beliefs, right? Well, and sometimes we just need to listen to what they're saying and try to talk in that way. What else? What are some ways that these verses help us towards greater spiritual growth? So, yes. I thought it was Josh. I was ignoring him, but it's you, so go ahead. Go ahead. Just kidding.
I think it leads us more to becoming more wise.
Okay.
And one of the things that I taught in my teenage girls class this past Sunday was about being wise and knowledge and wisdom and what to do. It wasn't about spiritual growth
Yeah, go ahead.
my girls. It just said, it says, it's been said that knowledge consists of knowing a tomato is fruit. Wisdom is knowing not to put a tomato in a fruit salad. And I thought that was a
It's
really,
pretty good.
it was a good way to introduce, like,
Yeah.
be able to, not just about knowledge, it's about being wise. And so I thought when you're talking about spiritual growth, I'm thinking about, how am I growing in wisdom? Not like just can I memorize verses or can I do this for knowledge? How am I growing in wisdom?
Yeah, so we've talked about this, right? Back when we were talking about verse 5, we talked about the idea of wisdom and knowledge. Are they the same? No. If I were to ask you, do you know that you're to be swift to hear? I'm sure everybody would raise their hand. Do you know that you're to be slow to speak? Everybody would raise their hand. Slow to anger, everybody would raise their hand. So you're knowledgeable. But it's when we apply those things that shows wisdom. That's when we gain the wisdom, is when we apply those things. We apply that knowledge in a way that helps us to have an impact on a situation or on how much we grow. Josh?
Isn't that the hardest part?
Well, sure.
Anybody can gain the knowledge, but that wisdom, the application of that knowledge, that's the difference.
But that's how we grow. That's the idea of spiritual growth. If you just have it and you don't apply it and you don't do anything with it, you're not going to grow. It's when those times are tough. That's what the first 6 verses of James 1 talks about. You're going to have trials. You're going to have these temptations. It's what the whole book, the whole chapter is about here. And then how does that get us to this point, starting in verse 19, where our faith starts getting stronger? We start growing spiritually. It's exactly the point, right? It's going to be tough. God never said it was going to be easy. But that's when we grow. Julie?
I think it's also you grow when you realize that you mess up and you try better next time. Like just okay, I wasn't good at controlling my anger
Yeah.
this time.
Yeah. And the next time when you get triggered, right, you're like, okay, let me take a step back, let me think about this, and yeah, absolutely, yeah. Yeah, and who hasn't been there, right? How many times have we had to go back to somebody and say, you know what, I really messed up. I apologize for something I said or did or whatever the case was, because I let anger get the best of me or whatever it was that got, that led me down that path to say or do something. Josh? Yeah.
I don't know that you can grow to where you want to be until you first acknowledge where you are.
Okay.
So it's easy for us to say, I want to get better at something, but until we say where we are, I don't know that you can get better at something.
It's good to have a goal too, right? Hey, I want to get here by this time, or I want to try to achieve some level or be a better person. We talked about this. Every year my New Year's resolution is I want to be better than I was last year, right? And so we try to grow in such a way that we do better. And these areas, this idea around being able to effectively listen and speak, being slow to speak, and then of course not letting those things produce any kind of anger or wrath in us. That's a huge step in being able to have the kind of faith that will allow us to be that kind of person, that has that kind of growth. Buddy?
When you're trying to reach the point of spiritual growth, you need the knowledge, you need the wisdom, but you also need wisdom. You also need courage.
Courage, yeah.
Courage, because the courage is how you display your knowledge and wisdom.
Yeah.
And sometimes if we don't have the courage, the other two don't matter.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. So you got to have the wisdom, you got to have the knowledge, but then it takes the courage to take it to that next level. I think you make a great point there. I think that's when we see that we've reached a point. We've reached a higher point than maybe where we were. It's those times when you're like, boy, 5 years ago I wouldn't have said one word to that person about the Bible or about Scripture or about anything like that. But today it doesn't bother me so much because there was a point where it took that courage for me to really step out there. And then it continues to take that courage to use the wisdom and the knowledge that we have to still get out there and do what we're supposed to do, right?
And when you have done that, you will grow spiritually.
Absolutely. Yeah, your growth from a spiritual standpoint will increase, no question. All righty. Next week we will be in verse 21. Thank you for your comments, and I appreciate everybody being here.